they're limited. The Carnegie Endowment a few days ago, two of its specialists reported that while names have changed, the regimes remain. And they pointed out that a change in ruling elites and system of governance is still a distant goal in both countries. The report goes on to discuss internal barriers to democracy. For example, the role of the Egyptian military in dominating a large part of the economy. But it doesn't touch the external barriers, which, as always, are quite significant. The United States and its Western allies are sure to do whatever they can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. To understand why, it's only necessary to look at the studies of Arab public opinion that are conducted by leading U.S. polling agencies, released by prestigious institutions, most recent by the Brookings Institute in Washington. Well, these are barely reported. In fact, in the U.S., zero, no report. In England, I've been able to find one report by Jonathan Steele, a very good commentator. But they're not reported, but certainly known to planners. You can be certain of that. And what they reveal is that by overwhelming majorities, Arabs regard the United States and Israel as the major threats they face. In Egypt, 90% of the population regard the United States as the major threat. The figures for the general region are scarcely less. There are some who regard Iran as a threat, 10%. Opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that a majority believe that security would be improved if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, that's about 80%. Other figures are similar. So if public opinion were to influence policy, as would happen in anything that deserves the name of a democracy, the U.S. not only would not control the region, but would be expelled from it, Britain as well. That would undermine fundamental principles of global dominance that, in the case of Britain, go back more than a century, in the case of the United States, back to the Second World War. And that's not going to happen easily. Talk about democracy, that's for ideologists and propagandists. In the real world, elite dislike for democracy is very strong, and it's the norm. It's been reluctantly conceded by the better scholarship that, not just in this case, but globally, that the United States supports democracy insofar as it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. In that case, you can say democracy is fine, but not when it conflicts with it. And in this case, there's a massive conflict. Actually, the general elite contempt for democracy, not just planners, but the whole educated culture, that was revealed very dramatically in the reaction to the WikiLeaks exposures. The ones that received the most attention, big headlines and so on, euphoric commentary, were the cables reporting Arab support for the U.S. stand on Iran. The reference, of course, was to the ruling dictators. The attitudes of the public were unmentioned because they're insignificant in our intellectual culture. There's a guiding principle that was stated pretty clearly by Carnegie Endowment Middle East specialist Marwan Muashar, who's formerly a high official of the Jordanian dictatorship. The principle is, there is nothing wrong, everything's under control. In short, if the dictators support us, what else could matter? If the dictators support us, population's passive, quiet, beaten down, not making any noise, everything's fine. That's our conception of democracy, actually domestically as well, I should say. This Muashar doctrine is it's rational and it's venerable. Let me just mention one case that's highly relevant today and ought to be kind of headlines if the free press were functioning. This is 1958. internal discussion in the United States since declassified. President Eisenhower expressed concern about what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not by governments, they're okay, but by the people. The highest planning body in the U.S., the National Security Council, issued a memorandum in which they explained what it's all about. They explained that there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports dictatorships and blocks democracy and development, and that we do that so as to ensure control over their energy resources. Furthermore, the NSC went on, the perception's accurate, and furthermore, it's what we should be doing, relying on the Washer doctrine. As long as the people are subdued and quiet, repressed, the dictators support us, everything's fine. That's 1958. There were Pentagon studies conducted after 9/11, reached very much the same conclusion, and the same holds today. And furthermore, that's the understanding in the educated culture in the West, as you can see, for example, from the reaction to the WikiLeaks doctrines, revelations, and even from the lack of reporting of Arab public opinion. I don't know about the Dutch press, you can tell me, but in the press that I've looked at, it's not even mentioned, because who cares what Arabs think, as long as the dictators support us. Of course, if they raise their heads, we have to do some things, but not much. Well, it's quite normal for victors to consign history to the trash can, old-fashioned stuff of no interest. But the victims tend to take it pretty seriously for obvious reasons. So let me make a couple of few remarks on this topic. It's quite an important topic, but a couple of comments may be useful in this connection. Actually, today is not the first time that Egypt and the United States are facing similar problems and moving in opposite directions. That was also true in the early 19th century. Economic historians have pointed out that in, say, around 1830, Egypt was quite well placed to undertake rapid economic development, about the same time the U.S. was. They were more or less in the same situation. Both Egypt and the United States had rich agriculture. That included cotton, which was the fuel of the early industrial revolution, kind of the oil of the time. Of course, there was a difference. Unlike Egypt, the United States had to develop cotton production and a workforce by conquest, extermination, and slavery. Consequences still remain. One fundamental difference between Egypt and the United States, in fact, the determining one, was that the United States had gained independence and Egypt had not. Therefore, the United States was free to ignore the prescriptions of economic theory. They were delivered in the late 18th century by Adam Smith to the United States shortly after its independence, using terms that are quite familiar. In fact, they're pretty much the same as the ones that are preached to the so-called developing societies by the World Bank and the IMF and economic specialists today. Smith urged the liberated colonies to keep to what was later called their comparative advantage, to produce primary products for export and to import the superior British manufactures, and certainly not to attempt to monopolize the crucial goods, particularly cotton, the most important. Any other path, he wrote, would retard instead of accelerating the further increase in the value of their annual produce, and would obstruct instead of promoting the progress of their country toward real wealth and greatness. If any of you have studied economics,